I'm here today with Amy Julia Becker. Amy Julia is the author of White Picket Fences, Turning Toward Love in a World Divided by Privilege. She's also the author of Small Talk, Learning from My Children About What Matters Most, and also the author of A Good and Perfect Gift, Faith, Expectations, and a Little Girl Named Penny. And finally, Penelope Ayres, a memoir. Amy Julia is a graduate of Princeton University and Princeton Theological Seminary, and her essays about faith, family, and disability have appeared in the Washington Post, USA Today, Christianity Today, Christian Century, and online for the New York Times, ABC News, The Atlantic, Vox, and the Huffington Post. And Amy Julia has been a featured speaker at many of our Writing for Your Life conferences and events. And we're really glad to have her participate in our new book project, How to Heal Our Divides. So, Amy Julia, thanks so much for being here with us again.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So, kind of before we get into the new book, why don't we go back and, kind of maybe you could tell us a little bit more about your background, how you got started writing.
Sure. It's funny. I've got 3 kids who are 15, 12, and 10. And throughout this pandemic time have had a lot of time on their hands. And I've been wanting desperately for them to create something. And it's made me think about my childhood and just the fact that I really did, when I was a little kid, I wrote poetry and short stories, and I just was always writing, but I never thought of myself as a writer until I had an experience where I was helping to care for my mother-in-law when she had cancer. This is in my mid-20s. I was going to seminary, or applied to seminary at the time, and I just started journaling about the experience of knowing that someone I loved was going to die. And over the course of the next 5 years, those journal entries turned into a book, and I realized how much I loved the process of writing, and especially of trying to weave together the story of what's going on in my own life with bigger ideas, questions, thoughts I had. As I said, I was in seminary at the time, so those are particularly questions I had about faith and hope and love in the midst of real human life, whether that's the big picture suffering of someone experiencing a terminal diagnosis, or the more ordinary life of having small children and figuring out how to hold on to a sense of self in the midst of that. And so everything has kind of flowed out of that.
Well, one of the books that I mentioned that has been so impactful for many people is the most recent one, White Picket Fences, which came out in 2018.
Right.
And it talks a lot about privilege. And I know that, you've not only published the book, but spoken about it and led groups discussions about it all over. So maybe you could please tell us more about that book and kind of how it's evolved since then.
Sure. So White Picket Fences is a memoir about being a person of privilege. And so it is dealing with issues of race and class and also disability. Our daughter Penny, who is now 15, was diagnosed with Down syndrome shortly after she was born. And in many ways, that experience of her birth and how I responded to her diagnosis, I probably never would have written White Picket Fences without that, even though as a white woman who grew up in a small town in the South and then moved to Connecticut, I was an African-American studies minor in college. I have thought about these things as a Christian for many, many years. But what I realized when Penny was born was that she was both born inside this world of expectations and really seen from the outside at a world of whiteness and wealth and education, kind of the American dream. This is where you're supposed to be. But she also was born excluded from that because of having a disability, both in terms of past history of discrimination and also just a present reality that the world was not made for her in so many ways. And at first with Penny, what I wanted was to bring her into the space that I had always lived in. I wanted to break down barriers so that she could be like me. But over time, I began to recognize how much she had to offer in and of herself, how much people like her, people with intellectual disabilities, people who were on the margins of society for whatever reason, how much they had to offer me in drawing me out of that place. So it became less a sense of, I want to break down barriers so that you can be like me, and more, I want to break down barriers so that we can love each other and so that we can learn from each other. And of course, some of the advantages and opportunities that I've been given simply because I'm a white woman with access to education and where people see my face and have certain assumptions or read my name and make certain assumptions, those types of opportunities should be available to so many more people. And I do want to break down those barriers of access. But I also looked at my life of like achievement, perfectionism, individualism, and I saw the destruction that was happening not only because of people being excluded from that life, but because of living it, and the degree of depression and substance abuse and despair among people who are ostensibly at this place of advantage within our society. And so that's what got me to thinking about, I think the subtitle for White Picket Fences is Turning Towards Love in a World Divided by Privilege. And it got me to really thinking about, especially for people of faith, what does it mean for love to actually cut through these dividing lines in a way that is not just about everybody becoming the same, but about actually celebrating the diversity that we have, understanding one another, giving and receiving from one another instead of building a hierarchy of human value. And that is what really ultimately led to writing White Picket Fences. And then on the heels of that, as you said, I put this book out into the world, which really is just my story of a woman growing up in the South, moving to Connecticut, having a baby with Down syndrome, and wrestling with all of these questions. And at the end of the book, I really the final words in the book are, do we want to get well? And it's picking up on a story of Jesus interacting with a man in John, the Gospel of John, where he says to him, do you want to get well? And feeling like there's so much harm that has been done in our culture and in our individual lives. Do we want to get well? Is that something that we actually want? But what I found when I went out into the world and started talking about this book with schools and with churches and with people all over the place is this eagerness to do something. What can I do in response? And I was pretty hesitant to actually give a response because I didn't want it to be a checklist and a sense of, okay, I've done my 3 good things and now I can go back to my comfortable life. But over time, I was able to develop a response that felt holistic and lifelong, but also simple enough for an ordinary person to say, okay, how can I respond to the harms of social divisions? Well, I can use my head, my heart, and my hands. And so that's the book that, again, it's more of a companion to White Picket Fences than a standalone book, although it is available in ebook and, paperback form. It's called Head, Heart, Hands, and it's a companion to White Picket Fences to help people put some of those ideas into action.
That's really great. The whole How to Heal Our Divides effort is intended to be, how do we put things into action? And to highlight, organizations and programs that are doing that.
Yeah.
So, I'm really glad to have you participate in this, to share, the experiences that you've shared since the release of White Picket Fences and the Head, Heart, and Hands model.
Yeah, thank you.
So, Amy Julia, maybe you can go into a little bit more detail on this model, the Head, Heart, and Hands model.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I say head, heart, and hands in some ways because that is the progression that tends to happen in my own life. I think about things for a long time before I'm able to connect on a more emotional or spiritual feeling level. And then I take action. I think for other people that happens in a different order. And for all of us, we probably, my problem is that I'm inclined to just think about things and never take action and never connect with people. There are other people who are going to rush to action without thinking about them. And so the Head, Heart, Hands is a way of saying, okay, wait a second, is there some degree of balance in how I'm approaching whatever issue is in front of me? And the way I think about it is, especially when it comes to social divisions, there's always a history. And so this is the head piece. There's always a context. For me, for example, I remember looking at my bookshelf. I write about this in White Picket Fences, and seeing that we were only reading chapter books with white children, white characters to our kids. And at first, my response actually in that case was, okay, I just need to get some new books. I need to take action and change this so that my kids are interacting with a diverse cast of characters. But then I started to research books, and I realized that there had been a history of a lack of publishing for authors and characters who are people of color for 100 years. So it was actually hard to find those books. And so understanding that history was going to allow for different actions than I would have had or taken otherwise. Similarly, just to use that same example and moving to the heart, when we move to the heart, it's connecting with people. And so in that case, I connected with a friend of mine who's a Black Christian woman, Patricia Raybon, who you also have had at Writing for Your Life conferences. And I asked her, I was like, Pat, what do you do in terms of reading to your grandchildren? And what books did you read to your children? Because especially if I did find books with African-American characters in them, they were really sad, and they often told a history of brutality. And she responded by saying, Amy Julia, it has never crossed my mind that I wouldn't share that history with my children, because they need to know that it can be dangerous for them to go into this world. And if your kids, as white kids growing up in America, don't know that, well, then they could become the danger. And so having that heart connection, my head connection first led me to this action. I'm going to take action and change my bookshelf. But that didn't really work. And so I had to go back and do some, research and thinking, moved on to my friend, and having that connection on the heart level also changed the ways in which I was going to act. Now, all of that is very individual. And I think it's really important that we recognize that we can take individual steps towards change. The conversations we have with our kids, the news sources that we are, getting information from, our willingness to, whether it's, give money or give time to organizations and thinking about how we're spreading that out. All of those things can happen individually. But on the hands level, I don't think it's just a matter of taking individual steps, but there's also looking at where are there areas of influence that I have, whether that's I'm a part of a neighborhood, I'm a part of a church community, I'm a part of a school community, and I'm going to start maybe asking some uncomfortable questions about our zoning policies in our town and who's allowed to live here, or the ways in which at church, so one of the things I've thought about a lot is, are people with disabilities not just allowed to be here, but really welcomed here? What does the architecture of our church or the programming of our church communicate? And how can I use my influence? I happen to be on our church council to ask some questions in order to create greater wheelchair accessibility or different programming for students who might have learning challenges. And those are the types of ways in which I think we can start using our influence and not just making individual changes. And then finally, there's institutional change, which really does require banding together with other people, even for people who are in charge of an institution, and most of us are not. Institutional change doesn't happen by any one individual saying, here's my decree. I mean, we see this even on a policy level when our president issues an executive order. Well, it can be overturned by the next president. So the individual with power can make an institutional change that can then be overturned. But institutional change will happen when all of Congress agrees to pass a law that changes an institutional level. And the same happens if you trickle down into schools and churches and denominations and the legal system. All of these things are going to take people banding together in order to make that type of institutional change. So there's like individual, influential, and institutional change, all of which I think is a part of taking action. And I should say one more thing on this. So I talked about the head, getting information, and the heart, I talked about just friendship. But I also think another aspect to the heart is having spiritual sustenance, being rooted and grounded in some sort of faith community or tradition that provides a source of power, strength, love outside of ourselves. And so that's a way to avoid the burnout and kind of what's called often compassion fatigue that comes in engaging with social problems that are perhaps bigger than our everyday lives. So the head, the heart, the hands, it's, getting information, connecting with people, and in my case with God, but with some sort of spiritual source of strength and love, and then taking action to put those things out into the world.
It's a really powerful framework. I love the way that you've organized that mentally.
Thank you.
And just as kind of a side note, I should say that recently Compassionate Christianity has introduced a program to create a database of children's books that are diverse and inclusive. It's intended to be a resource for people, that are looking for ministerial resources, parenting resources that do have diverse characters, come from diverse authors, are inclusive in terms of, multiple dimensions, including abilities. So that's something you can check out on compassionatechristianity.org.
And I will definitely do that. And I will say, I probably started asking these questions if Penny's 15 now, so 10 years ago. And there really has been a change in the past 10 years. And so I think that is really encouraging, that although I think Pat Raybon was right when she told me that I should be introducing my kids to this history of enslavement and Jim Crow and various levels of brutality, one of the things that I've also heard, not only from white people, but from African-American and other people of color as well, is where are the science fiction books with kids of color in them? Like, where are the fantasy novels? This doesn't just have to be historical fiction about how hard it has been to live in America. And I will say, like, for example, my daughter, Marilee, just did a school project where they had to pick someone to read a biography of, and she picked Kamala Harris. And so it wasn't, yes, she heard and learned some things that are hard about our history, but she also got to celebrate the first female Black vice president and recognize that the history of African Americans and other people of color in this country is a complex one that involves hardship and so many things to celebrate. So I'm just glad that there is that array of books that's starting to be out there, that's not just about the very hard aspects of our history, but also the things to celebrate.
Wonderful. Well, Amy Julia, I really want to say thank you for your contributions, to your own books and to the How to Heal Our Divides book, particularly because I think it gives a valuable model for people who do want to take action, that do want to get involved, that do want to make some changes to help the situations that we see ourselves in. So thank you very much for that.
Well, thanks for having me. I do think there are so many people who are not in a position to change their entire lives and move to a new place or to start a nonprofit, and yet who have really awoken in the past year, especially, to some of the real disparities and injustices in our nation and want to do something. And so saying that, taking the next small step in a thoughtful, lifelong, committed way will ultimately lead to transformation. And that's certainly been true for me, not only in my own life, but in my family and even in my community, because of the people I've been able to connect with and the changes that we've been able to see. And it's been good and beautiful, really, for all of us.
Well, I think you're a wonderful role model for many of us to follow. So thank you for doing that and showing us the way.
Well, a little bit of it, maybe. Thank you, Brian.